Good afternoon. The residential school system is a dark and painful part of the Canadian story. And sadly, new chapters are still being added to this sad history. Just days ago, the discovery of a mass grave in Kamloops containing the remains of 215 school children is a heartbreaking reminder of the pain Indigenous children, their families, and communities were subjected to through residential schools. This weekend, my 9-year-old son, Jack, asked me why the flags were lowered to half-mast in Ottawa. I had the difficult task of explaining to him the terrible news of the graves of children found at the site of a residential school. "Kids aren't supposed to die at school, Dad," he said to me. As a parent, it is devastating to think of 215 children buried by their school and lost for decades. It should also be a shocking reminder of our duty to heal the wounds from this horrific part of our history. Today, I'm writing to the Prime Minister to ask him to take immediate action to address this unspeakable discovery and support the Indigenous communities and our country in mourning. La découverte d'une fosse commune contenant les corps de 215 écoliers nous rappelle la souffrance et l'horreur que les enfants autochtones, leurs familles et leurs communautés ont subi dans les pensionnats. Aujourd'hui, j'écris au Premier ministre pour lui demander de prendre des mesures immédiates pour faire face à cette horrible découverte. Nous devons soutenir les communautés autochtones. Tout le pays est en deuil. First, we ask the Prime Minister to accelerate the completion of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to actions number 71 to 76, dealing with missing children. We ask that this be done in partnership with Indigenous communities across the country. The Conservative opposition will support swift and immediate efforts to help give families and communities closure and a time for healing. Aussi, dans l'esprit de la réconciliation, nous demandons au Parlement canadien d'adopter le projet de loi C8 afin de reconnaître les droits ancestraux ou issus des traités des Premières Nations, des Inuits et des Métis. Cette loi va aussi intégrer dans le serment de citoyenneté des références aux droits ancestraux et issus des traités des Premières Nations, des Inuits et des Métis. Ensemble, nous participons au processus de réconciliation. I have asked for the government's support in implementing these commitments as soon as possible. Today is not about partisanship or politics. It's simply the right thing for our country to do and an essential step in reconciliation. Every party, indeed every Canadian, has a role to play in reconciliation. Aujourd'hui, ce n'est pas une question de partisanerie ou de politique. C'est une étape essentielle vers la réconciliation. Chaque parti, de même que chaque Canadien, a un rôle à jouer dans la réconciliation. We must work together to ensure we bring our dark history to light, acknowledge it, and learn from it, and ensure nothing like it ever happens again. When I think of those 215 children, I think of the tremendous contributions they might have made had their futures not been stolen. The beautiful families they could have raised, the doctors, teachers, builders, innovators, knowledge keepers they could have become, the causes they would have championed. We owe it to each of them to make this right. Thank you.
Now we'll be taking questions, starting with question on the phone and alternating between the room and the phone to sanitize the mic between questions. Quick reminder as usual, one question and one follow-up. Nous allons maintenant prendre les questions commençant par les questions de téléphone et alternant les questions de la salle et au téléphone pour bien désinfecter le micro entre les questions. Je te rappelle une question avec une question de suivi. Today, Mr. O'Toole will take 6 questions. Aujourd'hui, M. O'Toole prendra 6 questions. Operator, do we have the first question?
Catherine Lévesque, la presse canadienne.
Oui, bonjour, M. O'Toole. Plus tôt ce mois-ci, votre parti avait demandé un débat sur la ligne 5 d'Enbridge. Vous avez obtenu ce débat d'urgence. Est-ce que vous êtes surpris maintenant que le président de la Chambre des communes ait refusé la tenue d'un débat d'urgence sur ces restes humains sur cette macabre découverte qui choque les Canadiens?
Je respecte le président de notre Chambre, mais c'est un enjeu important pour tous les Canadiens et Canadiennes. La réconciliation est primordiale pour notre pays parce qu'on doit apprendre les leçons de notre histoire et de notre chapitre triste avec la situation à Kamloops. Et c'est pourquoi aujourd'hui, j'écris le Premier ministre pour améliorer la situation pour les familles, les communautés en deuil.
Et puis en suivi, vous demandez des mesures immédiates au gouvernement de Justin Trudeau. Quelles pourraient être ces mesures immédiates et est-ce que vous seriez en faveur, par exemple, du fait qu'on donne davantage d'argent pour fouiller s'il y a d'autres cimetières sur les sites d'anciens pensionnats autochtones?
Les familles et les communautés autochtones, les familles affectées, les communautés affectées méritent de l'action et de guérison après cet triste événement à Kamloops. Et c'est pourquoi je viens de lancer mon idée de accélérer les appels à l'action à 71 à 76 sur la situation avec les pensionnats autochtones. C'est possible de démontrer du leadership, particulièrement quand notre pays est en deuil et il y a des appels à l'action spécifiques sur les enfants et les pensionnats. Et on doit prendre action maintenant.
We will take the next question from the floor. Nous allons prendre la prochaine question de la salle.
Hi, Mr. O'Toole, Mackenzie Gray with CPB. Today it came out that Air Canada paid $20 million in bonuses to their executives while they were negotiating a bailout with the government. Do you think it was right for Air Canada to do that? Or do you think the federal government should attempt to either retake back some of the money or change the terms they've set with Air Canada?
Thanks, Mackenzie. Last fall, we asked the government to provide certainty for travel and tourism, the sectors the hardest hit by the pandemic and the sectors that will likely be the slowest to rebound. We had several criteria as part of our willingness to work with the government: the restoration of regional routes, employment in the airlines and other specific sectors, an approach to refunds and rebates for families that were caught up, and to make sure that those funds directly went to frontline workers, not to bonuses and that sort of structure. Why the government took so long when they knew the House was willing to work with them, that's a question for the minister.
I just want to ask you, you're mentioning that you want the government to implement some of the recommendations of the TRC. One of those recommendations is for UNDRIP to be brought into Canadian law. 6 days ago, the Conservatives voted against that. Why do you only want to bring in some of the recommendations of the TRC, but not all of them? And what do you say to Indigenous Canadians looking out there who might think about voting for the Conservative Party when just a few days ago you went against one of the core recommendations, which was bringing UNDRIP into law again?
Well, I just finished a meeting with some Indigenous leaders in northern Quebec, and I spoke about UNDRIP, which we support all aspects of reconciliation in UNDRIP. The one provision we have concerns with was the lack of clarity with respect to free and prior informed consent, or whether that is a veto. Some of the questions we've been asking about that section are also being asked by Indigenous communities across the country. I want economic opportunity and economic reconciliation to be a huge part of how we heal this terrible history we have with respect to our First Nations and Indigenous Canadians, and holding back the opportunity for many of those communities to have success today is a stumbling block. That is why the one narrow provision of UNDRIP we have concerns with.
Next question.
Rafi Jikanian, CBC.
Thanks very much. Hi, Mr. O'Toole. We were just hearing about the city of Charlottetown removing its Sir John A. Macdonald statue in relation to the grave sites discovered at Kamloops. What do you think of this?
Well, Rafi, as you probably know, I've talked about our duty to reconcile discussions about our past with our commitment to reconciliation today. Those have to be respectful conversations, and even I've fallen short of my own expectations in that regard. But what we have to do is make sure that we're committed to reconciliation. And what I've proposed today is accelerating the Truth and Reconciliations Commission's recommendations dealing with missing children, 71 to 76. I'm asking Mr. Trudeau to move immediately. You will have the full support of the opposition. Let's show that we're going to use this terrible discovery last week to recommit to reconciliation. And 71 to 76, those calls to action will give the families some degree of closure and allow for healing that is so necessary. So this is beyond politics. Let's move swiftly on those calls to action.
There are a lot of people who would argue that removing Sir John A. Macdonald's statue is also beyond politics. It's an important symbolic gesture toward reconciliation. What do you say about that?
I want action, Rafi. I want commitments made. And if you look at the commitments I'm calling for today, 71 to 76, they will address providing some closure, helping families know if one of their ancestors was one of the children found in these graves. This demands action. And, you know, sometimes the clarity of a 9-year-old when I was explaining it to him shows that we have to move. Mr. Trudeau promised to implement all the reconciliation measures of the TRC and really has moved at a snail's pace. So I want Canadians to know, particularly Indigenous Canadians, that I will not just commit to words like the Prime Minister. I will commit to action and a process of healing and reconciliation.
We will take the next question from the floor.
Good afternoon, Mr. O'Toole, Leader Erin, Canadian Press. I wanted to ask you, on the day of Prime Minister Stephen Harper's moving apology for residential schools, Pierre Poilievre said he had to wonder whether Canadians were, quote, getting value for all of this money, unquote, being spent to compensate former students of federally financed residential schools. More recently, you told students at Ryerson University that the residential school system was intended to try and, quote, provide education. Both of you have apologized for these remarks, but what can you say to convince Canadians that you have any more credibility on this issue than Mr. Trudeau?
Thank you for raising that, Lee. I addressed it in my own remarks that I hold myself to a high standard to making sure that we have these discussions, including about our history, in a way that's respectful and informed. And when I fall short, I will hold myself to account. When Mr. Trudeau promises by a certain date to end boil water advisories, has no plan to get there, reconciliation is about building trust. It's about action. It's about calls to action. That's why I'm saying to him today, as opposition leader, on calls to action 71, 76, let's have a plan to show the country by Canada Day we will be en route to meeting those calls to action. And people can judge me by how I commit to delivering as opposed to announcing, like our current Prime Minister.
Former Conservative government refused to acknowledge the TRC's findings that what happened to children at residential schools amounted to, quote, cultural genocide. Are you willing to now support that key finding, and why or why not?
Well, Lee, I previously said I do think it was cultural genocide. People were taken from their culture, from their families, often to a community they weren't familiar with. And in speaking to my friend and colleague from Kamloops today, she described the setting, the orchard where these graves were found. It is an atrocity, and we have to act. And so I've made a clear commitment in this regard. Reconciliation was, and a TRC call to action was the first question I asked the Prime Minister as Leader of the Opposition. Today I'm saying let's act together. I'm sure there's will within all parties. I'd like the Prime Minister to move.
Operator, next question.
Stephanie Livitz, Toronto Star.
Hi there, Mr. O'Toole. I guess further to the point you appear to be making to PM that you want immediate action, I think you're alluding, your last comment said something about a timeline. So if you were to become Prime Minister, how would you handle the outstanding calls to action? Would you put the timeline on them and make it so by a certain date that they're all implemented?
I want Indigenous leaders, First Nation communities, to be part of the governance on implementing calls to action. I think there's a way to prioritize a number of them to move very quickly on, Stephanie. I think this horrific discovery reminds us of our commitment with respect to residential schools and missing children. There are several specific commitments in 71 to 76. Let's move. We need action here, and I'm afraid that the Prime Minister will once again talk about action, but not implement it. I'm asking him to do that. I'm going to hold him to account.
And I guess further, one of the things that Prime Minister seemed to be doing today was pointing out that tragically and cruelly, it ought not surprise people that a mass grave has been discovered. But this has been known. This is in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and Canadians need to do more work on their own score on reconciliation. And I wonder, then, for you, what does that look like for you? I mean, you had the incident with Ryerson. What have you done personally to advance the cause of reconciliation? And does it include reflecting on the fact that in 2009, the Conservative government was asked to fund a search for these very graves and said no?
I'm going to hold myself to a high standard. As I said, I think Canadians want reconciliation to be at the core of where our country is headed. And that's why my first question as opposition leader was on a call to action. It's why I'm watching very closely the inquiry into the horrific case of Joyce Echaquan in Quebec. It's why I was familiar with the calls to action 71 to 76, but we didn't know the extent of what was discovered in Kamloops, even though there were suggestions, I think, of 50 children that had died. This is a horrific finding, and our country needs to do more than just lower the flags. We need to recommit to reconciliation, and that's what I'm calling on today, with bipartisan support, hopefully, to move.
Operator, last question.
No question.
Thank you very much.
C'est tout le temps que nous avons, merci.